Right now, we're seeing a pretty large winter storm move through the Midwest, and we have the possibility of a major nor'easter developing by early next week. If we were to take a look at the latest depiction of the European model, this is how the radar is looking like at this point. We do see a very large area of snow through Iowa and into the northern Midwest as well. So this is something that you definitely need to pay close attention to, where you could expect anywhere from 3 to 6 to potentially over 6 inches of snow in certain portions of the Midwest. So we do see that the snow will extend into Michigan, northern Ohio, as well as northern Indiana, and Chicago will get involved. It seems like the rain snow line will be a little bit closer than anticipated to Chicago, as it seems like both of the computer models have detected that there's a little bit more of a warm air intrusion and a little bit of a stronger southerly flow to bring that warm air into Chicago. So you might get a little bit less snow than anticipated, but you still should expect accumulating snowfall right around the Chicago area. And moving forward, we do see that this snow will eventually move into the northeast, where Michigan, upstate New York, as well as northern Pennsylvania will get involved with heavier rounds of snow, as the slow pressure system will strengthen just a little bit as it approaches the northeast once it encounters more of that warm air, and of course the warmer Gulf Stream sea surface temperatures that are just off the coast. So we're going to see a little bit more instability. So you could expect anywhere from 3 to 6 to 1-3 inches of snow throughout southern upstate New York as well as northern Pennsylvania, and we will see the slow pressure system eventually strengthen quite a bit, dropping down to 989 millibars. But at this point, it should be well off the coast, as the forecast for at least this first snowstorm is pretty certain at this point that it'll take this sort of general trajectory and it'll strengthen at this sort of rate. There could of course be variations with the forecast as this storm system continues to head further eastward, but for the most part this forecast should be right around the ballpark, since we're approaching that 24 to 48 hour forecast range where the forecast becomes very certain for the northeast. So you should expect anywhere from 3 to 6 to maybe 1 to 3 inches of snow in the northeast from this first snowstorm. However, the second snowstorm has the possibility of being more significant for much of the northern Midwest, where we do see that the northern portions of North Dakota, Minnesota, as well as South Dakota could experience 3 to 6 or potentially a little bit more than 6 inches of snow from this storm system. We do see that there's going to be plenty of cold air behind it that's going to interact with a weaker ridge just to the south of it that's going to bring the warmer air further northward and create just enough of an unstable environment. And we do see the snow will eventually move eastward into the Great Lakes region, where we see a very large area of snow. And I'll say that for the northern Midwest, forecast is very certain. At this point, this is a general area where you should expect a large area of snow, around moderate to heavy snowfall, and it's pretty certain that this storm will temporarily, that's a key word, temporarily weaken as it approaches the Great Lakes, because the jet stream should straighten out, but eventually this cold core low pressure system will move southward once again as a result of a ridge that's building along the west coast. And typically when we see a lot of ridging along the west coast, that typically brings colder and snowier than average conditions to the eastern half of the United States, since the jet stream is forced well further northward when a ridge is built over the west coast. And of course we see a stronger northerly flow for the eastern half of the United States thanks to a more powerful ridge along the west coast. And that's exactly what's going to happen with this for as we approach next week with this low pressure system. It will eventually move southward, and we still of course see that warm core low pressure system right up along the southeast coast, and that's going to create a highly unstable environment for the potential of a nor'easter to develop by early next week, where we do see that the cold air will eventually interact with the warm core low pressure system, and we will see this low pressure system rapidly intensify based on the European model's depiction of this storm system. Now, there's still higher uncertainty with this forecast. I do believe that it's pretty certain we will see at least some sort of nor'easter just off the northeast coast, but the big question remains, how quickly will this strengthen and where exactly this low pressure system will go, because that's still uncertain, because we still have the European model leaning towards strengthening this low pressure system a little bit quicker than the GFS model, and we see the storm move closer along the coast where to the point where it brings more snow to the mid-Atlantic states and in the areas sort of southward in the Northeast, as well as New England, while the GFS model mainly restricts the snowfall more towards the New England states rather than the mid-Atlantic states. But we do see the pressure drops quite a bit, heavy snowfall throughout a large area of the Northeast. This includes eastern Pennsylvania, western New Jersey, a large portion of upstate New York, as well as the northern portions of New England. And this will eventually impact the areas closer along the coast, and we see the pressure again drop down to 977 millibars. We see the isobars very closely packed to each other, which represents that there's likely going to be very gusty winds with this storm system. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of coastal flooding, because when we see a storm system dropping down to 970s in millibar pressure, that's equivalent to category 3, almost category 3 strength, and with a wind field that large, that's bound to create the possibility of coastal flooding. So I wouldn't rule that out if you're along the coast. So this is definitely something to be aware of. And moving forward, we see the pressure drop even more, down to 969 millibars. So this storm is a powerhouse at this time. We see extremely heavy snowfall for much of southern New England, and we see the snow impact the larger population areas in the Northeast, like New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, all get involved with almost blizzard conditions at this point. So this is definitely something to be aware of. And another thing I want to point out is that it just stays parked over the Northeast for several hours and days thanks to a negative tilt. And when we see a negative tilt, that typically means that weather conditions will be extreme, because when we see a negative tilt, that represents that there's a high level of instability with this storm, because we have the warm air that's filtering in on the northern side and the cool air that's filtering on the southern side, and that creates just a very highly unstable environment. And not only that, a negative tilt typically slows down storm systems, because we see the jet stream wind shift from more of a westerly direction to an easterly direction, and that goes against what we typically see in the mid latitudes, where the winds move, of course, towards the west. And when we see that, that typically means that this storm that storms in a negative tilt are a lot slower, and that means it's going to be parked over the Northeast for several days, which could mean that this could be an extreme significant blizzard if the European model's forecast was correct. But of course, there's still uncertainty with the forecast. We're still going around 5 to 6 days out. A lot could change, especially since the GFS model isn't as lenient as bringing as powerful or as impactful of a snowstorm in the Northeast, but it does still expect a nor'easter to impact the Northeast, just more so in New England states. And I wouldn't say the GFS model scenario is as impactful, because the storm moves a little bit quicker, and the storm is a little bit weaker than the European model. That's due in part to the fact that the GFS model doesn't expect a negative tilt to build and doesn't expect as much instability to exist just off the Northeast coast. So we're going to need to pay very close attention to this over the next several days regarding any variations in the forecast, because this could be I don't want to make big statements like this, but this could potentially be historic if the European model scenario was correct as we approach early next week. So there's definitely something to be aware of for Northeast by next week, but make sure to pay close attention to the possibility of snow in the northern Midwest. The GFS model for this first snowstorm is showing a very similar forecast, where you could expect anywhere from 3 to 6 to potentially a little bit more than 6 inches of snow in portions of the Midwest, where we do see just enough instability, just enough convection for a heavy amount of snow to occur in the southern Great Lakes region, as well as the areas further northward as well. So Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, you need to pay close attention to this, because it is likely you will experience accumulating snowfall from this storm, as well as portions of the interior Northeast. And we could maybe see some snowfall in New Jersey and New York City, but I don't expect much accumulation from this specific snowstorm in those areas, as a big snowstorm should be this one that's gonna come off the Pacific Northwest of Canada and move into the northern Midwest, where we do see that this storm is going to encounter quite a bit of instability. However, the key difference is that the GFS model doesn't expect as significant of a jet stream dip, and what that means is that this storm is a lot slower in strengthening compared to the European model, where because if we were to compare the European model at this exact same position and time, the European model is a lot stronger stronger, where this low pressure system at this position would be closer to not the 980 millibar range rather than the 1000 millibar range a GFS model is currently forecasting. So we clearly see that this storm strengthens a lot slower than what the European model is forecasting, and it's not until it reaches New England to where we really get to see this storm strengthen down to 985 millibars. And we do see heavy snowfall in more of the Boston area, but we do see that much of the southern areas of the Northeast, such as the mid-Atlantic states and into New York City and Philadelphia, don't experience any snowfall at all in this scenario. While they do experience a little bit of snowfall, but it isn't much, and it won't be considered major at all for those cities. And we see that the storm isn't necessarily strong enough to bring as strong of winds to much of the Northeast, where we see the pressure still drop to 982 millibars, which is still moderately powerful, but not the powerhouse that the European model is forecasting, where the European model wants to bring the storm's pressure down to 969 millibars, which is quite powerful. But we can't disregard pressure of 980 millibars either. So we're going to need to wait and see how far this jet stream will dip as we approach early next week, because that'll determine how strong the storm will be, the exact trajectory of this storm. Because if we were to see the jet stream dip be a little bit more significant a little bit earlier, not only would this storm strengthen a little bit more, but this will move closer to the northeast coast, which would bring more impacts to the southern northeast, since the jet stream winds would shift more of a north from a southerly direction more quickly than what the GFS model is currently forecasting, which would steer the storm closer to the coast rather than a little bit further out to sea, mainly bringing impacts to New England rather than the entirety of the Northeast. So we're going to pay close attention to the small details like that, and the jet stream dip will be determined by how strong the ridging will be just along the west coast. Because if the ridging is a little bit stronger, you should expect a little bit more of a significant jet stream dip, and this low pressure system should move a little bit further southward for a more significant snowstorm to develop. So I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. We won't really get a good idea of how significant this jet stream build will be, I'll say probably until late this weekend into Sunday. Once that turn eventually occurs, when it exactly occurs will be a big determinant, and will definitely raise the certainty of this forecast regarding whether or not we're in for a major snowstorm in the Northeast or not. But I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. So let's say if the European model snowfall forecast was correct over the next several days, we do see that for this first snowstorm, you should again expect anywhere from 3 to 6, or potentially a little bit more than 6 inches of snow in certain areas in the Midwest, more specifically the eastern coast of Wisconsin, as well as the southern areas of upstate New York, as well as certain of the northern areas of Pennsylvania. But the second snowstorm, it definitely becomes extremely significant for the Northeast, where we see areas of over 2 feet of snow in Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and even northwestern New Jersey as we approach the midweek of next week, thanks to the nor'easter. And when we include the bigger cities, Boston is right on the border of receiving over a foot of snow. New York City as well, Philadelphia. This will be a very impactful winter storm for much of the Northeast, including the coastal areas. So we're going to need to pay close attention to this over the next several days. And even for the Midwest, this will be very impactful, where we see a large area of 6 to 12 inches of snow. And for the Midwest, forecast is very certain, but the Northeast, it becomes a little bit more uncertain with this second snowstorm. But I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. Now let's take a look at what the GFS model is stating. The GFS model for this first snowstorm is forecasting, like I said, a very similar forecast. But this second snowstorm, it is very similar to the European model when it comes to the northern Midwest, but fairly different when we take a look in the Northeast, where we see more of the heavy snowfall impact more of southern New England rather than the central Northeast, where we see that New York City and Philadelphia don't get involved with as much snowfall, where you only experience 1 to 3 inches in those cities. But we see that the Boston area would experience close to 2 feet of snow in the GFS model scenario over the next 7 days, which would of course be extremely significant. We're going to need to pay close attention to the trajectory and how fast the storm will develop over the next several days to really give you guys a more certain forecast regarding where exactly the heaviest snow will fall. I'll keep you guys updated. Like I said in my previous video, we're in the negative North Atlantic oscillation phase, which means that we're more likely going to experience colder and snowier than average conditions over the next several weeks in the eastern half of the United States. So this is definitely something you need to be aware of since winter is not over yet, and this negative North Atlantic oscillation could potentially bring the worst of the winter for many areas in the northern Midwest as well as the Northeast over the next several weeks. So we want to pay close attention to this because this could definitely change your fortunes this winter for many areas. So here's my forecast over the next 6 days. So we do see that I'm forecasting a large area of 6 to 12 inches of snow. This is based on what the European model is currently stating. Of course, this forecast is subject to change. We're going to need to wait and see which model will be the correct one, which model caves to the other one. But it's definitely becoming increasingly likely that the Midwest will be in for a significant week when it comes to winter weather, where you could expect a large area of 6 to 12 inches of snow, and Northeast could be involved with that as we approach next week, especially with next week's early week snowstorm. So I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. But thank you guys for watching.